Section 23 of the Glories of Ireland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Glories of Ireland, edited by Joseph Dunn and P.J. Lennox. Section 23, The Irish in Canada, by James J. Walsh, M.D., Ph.D., Litt.D., Sc.D. When Wolfe captured Quebec and Canada came under British rule, some of the best known of his officers and several of his men were Irish. After the peace was signed, many of them settled in Canada, not a few of them marrying French wives, and as a consequence there are numerous English, Scotch, and English names among the French-speaking inhabitants of Lower Canada. Two of Wolfe's officers, Colonel Guy Carleton, born at Strabane in the county Tyrone, and General Richard Montgomery, born only 7 miles away at Convoy in the same county, were destined to play an important role in the future history of Canada. Montgomery was in command of the Revolutionary Army from the colonies when it attempted to take Quebec, and Carleton, who had been a trusted friend of General Wolfe, was in command of the Canadian forces. The two men were the lives of their respective commands, and with the death of Montgomery, Carleton's victory was assured. Carleton was made Governor-in-Chief of Canada, and during the trying years of the early British rule of New France and the American Revolution, his tact did more than anything else to save Canada for the British. Bibeau, the French historian, says, quote, "The man to whom the administration of the government was entrusted had known how to make the Canadians love him, and this contributed not a little to retain, at least within the bounds of neutrality, those among them who might have been able, or believed themselves able, to ameliorate their lot by making common cause with the insurgent colonies." End quote. Shortly after being made governor, Carleton went to England and secured the passage of the Quebec Act through the English Parliament, which gave the Canadian French assurance that they were to be ruled without oppression by the British government. Subsequently, in 1786, Carleton, as Lord Dorchester, became the first Governor-General of Canada, being given jurisdiction over Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, as well as Upper and Lower Canada, and to him more than to any other is due the early loyalty to the British Crown in the Dominion. After the army, the next important source of Irish population in Canada were the Loyalists, who, after the Revolution, removed from the United States to the British dominions in America. There were probably many thousands of them, more than enough to make up for the French who left Canada for France when the territory passed over to England. Among the Irish Loyalists who went to Canada was the Reverend John Stuart, who had become very well known as a missionary in the Mohawk Valley before the Revolution, and who, though born a Presbyterian, was destined to win the title of the Father of the Church of England in Upper Canada. When the first Canadian Parliament met in December 1792, Edward O'Hara was returned for Gaspé in Lower Canada, and D'Arcy McGee could boast that henceforward Lower Canada was never without an Irish representative in its legislative councils. When the question of settling Upper Canada with British colonists came up, Colonel Talbot, a County Dublin man, was the most important factor. He obtained a large grant of land near what is now London and attracted settlers into what was at that time a wilderness. The tract settled under his superintendence now comprises 29 townships in the most prosperous part of Canada. The Maritime Provinces had been under British rule before the fall of Quebec and contained a large element of Irish population. In Newfoundland in 1753, out of a total population of some 13,000, Davin says that there were nearly 5,000 Catholics, chiefly Irish. In 1784, a great new stimulus to Irish immigration to Newfoundland was given by Father O'Connell, who in 1796 was made Catholic bishop of the island. Newfoundland, for its verdure, the absence of reptiles, and its Irish inhabitants, was at this time called Transatlantic Ireland, and Bonnycastle says that more than one half of the population was Irish. In 1749, Governor Cornwallis brought some 4,000 disbanded soldiers to Nova Scotia and founded Halifax. 10 years later, it was described as subdivided into Halifax proper, Irishtown, or the southern, and Dutchtown, or the northern suburbs. The inhabitants numbered 3,000, one-third of whom were Irish. They were among the most prominent men of the city and province. In the Privy Council for 1789 were Thomas Corcoran and Charles Morris. Morris was the president of the Irish Society, and Matthew Cahill the sheriff of Halifax in that year. A large number of Irish from the north of Ireland settled in Nova Scotia in 1763, calling their settlement Londonderry. They provided a fortunate refuge for the large numbers of Irish Presbyterians who were expelled from New England by the intolerant Puritans the following year. They also welcomed many Loyalists who came from New York and the New England states after the acknowledgment of the independence of the American colonies by Great Britain. Between the more eastern settlers around Halifax and those in the interior, the greater part of the population of Nova Scotia was probably Irish in origin. It was in the maritime provinces that the first step in political emancipation for Catholics under British rule was made. In 1821, Lawrence Kavanagh, a Roman Catholic, was returned to the Assembly of the province for Cape Breton. He would not subscribe to the declaration on transubstantiation in the oath of office tendered him, and as a consequence was refused admittance to the Assembly. But he was elected again and again, and 6 years afterwards Judge Haliburton, better known by his nom de plume of Sam Slick, in an able speech seconded the motion to dispense with the declaration, and Kavanagh was permitted to take the oath without the declaration. The War of 1812 brought over from Ireland a number of Irish soldiers serving in the British Army, many of whom after the war settled down and became inhabitants of the country. They were allotted farmlands and added much to Canada's prosperity. A type of their descendants was Sir William Hingston, whose father was at this time a lieutenant adjutant in the Royal 100th Regiment, the Dublins. Sir William's father died when his son was a mere boy, but the lad supported his mother, worked his way through the medical school, saved enough money to give himself 2 years in Europe, and became a great surgeon. He was elected 3 times Mayor of Montreal, serving one term with great prestige under the most trying circumstances. He afterwards became a senator of the Dominion, and was knighted by Queen Victoria. Prince Edward Island was settled mainly by the Scotch and French, and yet many Irish names are to be found among its old families. It was ceded to Great Britain in 1763, and the first governor appointed was Captain Walter Patterson, whose niece, Elizabeth Patterson, was married to Jerome Bonaparte in Baltimore in 1803. Captain Patterson was so ardent an Irishman that through his influence he had an act passed by the Assembly changing the name of the island to New Ireland, but the home government refused to countenance the change. At this time the island was known as St. John's, and the name Prince Edward was given to it in honor of the Duke of Kent in 1789. One of the most popular governors of the island was Sir Dominick Daly, knighted while in office. He was a member of a well-known Galway family, and first came to America as secretary to one of the governors. He afterwards became provincial secretary for Lower Canada. Canada suffered from the aftermath of the revolutions which took place in Europe during the early part of the 19th century. The year 1837 saw 2 revolutions, one in Upper, the other in Lower Canada, though neither of them amounted to more than a flash in the pan. As might be expected, there were not a few Irish among the disaffected spirits who fostered these revolutions. Their experience at home led them to know how little oppressed people were likely to obtain from the British government, except by a demonstration of force. There were serious abuses, especially the family compact, the lack of anything approaching constitutional guarantees in government, and political disabilities on the score of religion. However, most of the Irish in Canada were ranged on the side of the government. Sir Richard Bonnycastle, writing in 1846, said, quote, "The Catholic Irish, who have been long settled in the country, are by no means the worst subjects in this transatlantic realm, as I can personally testify, having had the command of large bodies of them during the border troubles of 1837–8. They are all loyal and true." End quote. Above all, Bonnycastle pledged himself for the loyalty of the Irish Catholic priesthood. One of the Irishmen who came into prominence in the rebellions of 1837 was Edmund Bailey O'Callaghan, the editor of the Vindicator, the newspaper by means of which Papineau succeeded in arousing much feeling among the people of Lower Canada and fomented the Revolution. O'Callaghan escaped to the United States and settled at Albany, where he became the historian of New York State. To him, more than to any other, we owe the preservation of the historical materials out of which the early history of the state can be constructed. Rare volumes of the Jesuit Relations, to the value of which for historical purposes he had called special attention, were secured from his library for the Canadian Library at Ottawa. Towards the middle of the 19th century, when the population of Ireland reached its highest point of over 8,000,000, the pressure on the people caused them to emigrate in large numbers, and then the famine came to drive out great crowds of those who survived. In proportion to its population, Canada received a great many more of these Irish emigrants than did the United States. Unfortunately, the conditions on board the emigrant sailing vessels in those days cost many lives. They were often becalmed and took months to cross the ocean. My grandmother, coming in the 30s, was 93 days in crossing, landing at Quebec after 7 weeks on half rations, part of the time living on nothing but oatmeal and water. Ship fever, the dreaded typhus, broke out on her vessel as on so many others, and more than half of the passengers perished. Many, many thousands of the Irish emigrants thus died on shipboard or shortly after landing. In 1912, the ancient order of Hibernians erected near Quebec a monument to the victims. In spite of the untoward conditions, emigration continued unabated, and in 1875, in the population of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, it was calculated that the Irish numbered 846,414, as compared with 706,369 English, and 549,946 Scotch. Hatton, quoted by Davin in The Irishman in Canada. It had become clear that Canada would prosper more if united than in separate provinces jealous of each other. The first move in this direction came from the Maritime Provinces, where the Irish element was so much stronger than elsewhere, and when a conference of the leading statesmen of these provinces was appointed to be held at Charlottetown, PEI, September 1864, representatives of Upper and Lower Canada asked to be allowed to be present, to bring forward a plan for a federation of all the British provinces in North America. The British North America Act was passed and received the royal assent, the Queen appointing July 1, 1867, as the formal beginning of the Dominion of Canada. Among the men who were most prominent in bringing about federation, and who came to be known as the Fathers of Confederation, were several distinguished Irishmen. Thomas D'Arcy McGee was the best known, and probably did more than any other Canadian to make the idea of Confederation popular by his writings and speeches. He had come to Canada as a stranger, edited a newspaper in Montreal, and was elected to the Assembly after a brief residence, in spite of the opposition cries of Irish adventurer and stranger from abroad, and was subsequently elected 4 times by acclamation, and was Minister of Agriculture and Education, and Canadian Commissioner to the Paris Exposition of 1867. His letters to the Earl of Mayo, pleading for the betterment of conditions in Ireland, were quoted by Gladstone during the Home Rule movement as "a prophetic voice from the dead coming from beyond the Atlantic." Another of the Fathers of Confederation was the Honourable Edward Whalen, born in the County Mayo, who as a young man went to Prince Edward Island, where he gained great influence as a popular journalist. He was an orator as well as an editor, and came to have the confidence of the people of the island, and hence was able to do very much for federation. A third of the Fathers of Confederation from the Maritime Provinces was the Honourable, afterwards Sir Edward Kenny, who, when the first cabinet of the new Dominion was formed, was offered and accepted one of the portfolios in recognition of the influence which he had wielded for Canadian union. At all times in the history of Canada, the Catholic hierarchy has been looked up to as thoroughly conservative factors for the progress and development of the country. After the Irish immigration, most of the higher ecclesiastics were Irish by birth or descent, and they all exerted a deep influence not only on their own people, but on their city and province. One of the fathers of Confederation was Archbishop Connolly of Halifax, of whom the most distinguished Presbyterian clergyman of the lower provinces said the day after his death, "I feel that I have not only lost a friend, but as if Canada had lost a patriot. In all his big-hearted Irish fashion, he was ever at heart, in mind, and deed, a true Canadian." Among his colleagues of the hierarchy were such men as his predecessor, Archbishop Walsh, Archbishop Lynch, the first Metropolitan of Upper Canada when Toronto was erected into an archbishopric, Bishop Hogan of Kingston, Archbishop Hannon of Halifax, Archbishop Walsh of Toronto, and Archbishop O'Brien of Halifax, all of whom were esteemed as faithful Canadians, working for the benefit of their own people more especially, but always with a larger view of good for the whole Commonwealth of Canada. The Irish continued to furnish great representative men to Canada. The first governor, Guy Carleton, was Irish, and his subsequent governor-generalship as Lord Dorchester did much to make Canada loyal to Great Britain. During the difficult times of the Civil War in the United States, Lord Monck, a Tipperary man, was the tactful governor-general, "like other Irish governors, singularly successful in winning golden opinions." Davin. Probably the most popular and influential of Canada's governors-general was Lord Dufferin, another Irishman. Some of the most distinguished of Canadian jurists, editors, and politicians have been Irishmen, and Irishmen have been among her great merchants, contractors, and professional men. In our own time, Sir William Hingston among the physicians, Sir Charles Fitzpatrick among the jurists, and Sir Thomas George Shaughnessy among the administrative financiers are fine types of Irish character. References: Davin, The Irishman in Canada, Toronto, 1877. McGee, Works. Tracy, The Tercentenary History of Canada, New York, 1908. Walsh, Sir William Hingston in the American Catholic Quarterly, January, 1911. Edmund Bailey O'Callaghan in the Records of the American Catholic Historical Society, 1907. McKenna, A Century of Catholicity in Canada, in the Catholic World, Volume 1, page 229. End of section 23. Recording by Owen Cook in Potawatomi Ceded Land on Canada Day, 2017.
Section 24 of The Glories of Ireland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Glories of Ireland, edited by Joseph Dunn and P.J. Lennox. Section 24. The Irish in South America by Marion Mulhall. 1. From the Spanish Conquest to the War of Independence. South America, although comparatively little known until recent times to the outside world, contains much to interest the missionary, the scientist, the historian, the traveler, and the financier. The 20th century will probably see hundreds following in the footsteps of their predecessors. In the meantime, the brilliant achievements of numerous Irish men and women in that part of the world are falling into oblivion, and call for a friendly hand to collect the fragments of historical lore connected with their exploits. This paper will cover 3 periods. 1. From the Spanish Conquest to the War of Independence. Here the principal actors were maritime explorers, buccaneers, and mercantile adventurers. 2. The War of Independence from 1810 to 1826. In this period, Irishmen performed feats of valor worthy to rank with those in Greek or Roman history. 3. Since the independence, a period of commercial and industrial development, in which Irishmen have played a foremost part. It has been said that George Barlow, the companion of Sebastian Cabot, was an Irishman. Cabot was the first Britisher to sail up the Rio de la Plata, and gave it its name just 35 years after the discovery of America. Barlow was in the service of the King of Spain, and in that country met Cabot, who had been appointed Pilot Major to His Majesty in the year 1518. In 1577 we read of the famous Admiral Drake's expedition to the River Plate, which he reached on April 14, 1578. Evidently it was a successful one in the opinion of Queen Elizabeth, for on Drake's return to Plymouth, September 26, 1580, She came aboard his ship and knighted him. There seem to have been 3 Irishmen on this expedition: Fenton, Merrick, and Ward. Fenton, who was in command of 2 vessels, was attacked by a Spanish squadron between Brazil and the River Plate, and the battle continued by moonlight until one of the Spaniards was sunk. The Spanish historian adds that Fenton might have sunk another of the enemy's ships, but refrained because there were several women on board. Lozana, in his history, mentions a revolution in Paraguay in 1555, which was headed by an Irishman named Nicholas Colman. This revolution was quickly suppressed by the Spanish viceroy, Irala, but Colman led a second revolution in 1570, when Captain Riguelin was the governor of Weir. The mutineers named Colman for their chief, put their treasures into canoes, and floated down the Parana until their boats were capsized by some rapids, probably the falls of Apipe in Misiones. The viceroy, on hearing of the revolt, sent troops to bring back the fugitives, and the latter were treated with unusual clemency. Lozana describes Colman as a daring, turbulent buccaneer. For 15 years he seems to have played an important part in Weir. His subsequent fate is unknown. In 1626, an expedition commanded by James Purcell, an Irishman, established itself on the island of Tucojos, in the mouth of the Amazon. Captain Charles O'Hara was sent by Governor Arana from Montevideo in March 1761 to destroy the old landmarks of Rio Negro and Ching between the dominions of Portugal and Spain. The officer next under him was Lieutenant Charles Murphy, afterwards Governor of Paraguay. This expedition suffered great hardships. Several of the expeditions of the privateers of the 18th century sailed from Ireland. Dampier, a skillful navigator, went on a cruise to intercept the Spanish galleons returning from the River Plate with booty supposed to be worth £600,000 sterling. He sailed from Kinsale in September 1703 with 2 vessels, and no doubt amongst the crews were many Irishmen. It was on this expedition that Alexander Selkirk, a Scotch sailor, was put on shore at Juan Fernandez in 1704, where he remained until rescued by Captain Rogers, who commanded the Duke, a vessel of 320 tons, which sailed from Cork on September 1, 1708, touched by chance at Juan Fernandez, and found the original of Defoe's remarkable story Robinson Crusoe, who presented a wild appearance dressed in his goatskins. In 1765 Captain McNamara, with 2 vessels called the Lord Clive and the Ambuscade, mounting between them 104 guns, attempted to take Colonia, in front of Buenos Ayres, from the Spaniards. Having shelled the place for 4 hours, McNamara expected every moment to see a white flag hoisted, when by some mishap the Lord Clive took fire and 262 persons perished. The Spaniards fired upon the poor fellows in the water, only 78 escaping to land. McNamara was seen to sink. His sword was found a few years ago by a Colonia fisherman, who presented it to the British consul at Montevideo. Most of the Irish names still extant in the Argentine provinces, such as Sarsfield, Carroll, and Butler, are probably derived from these captives. Among the descendants of the survivors of McNamara's expedition may be mentioned the ablest lawyer ever known in Buenos Ayres and for many years Prime Minister, the late Dr. Velez Sarsfield, and also Governor O'Neill. The year 1586 saw an expedition of a very different character, consisting of the first Jesuits sent to convert Paraguay, under the direction of Father Thomas Field, an Irishman, and son of a Limerick doctor. Their vessel fell into the hands of British privateers off the Brazilian coast, but the sea rovers respected their captives, and after sundry adventures the latter landed at Buenos Ayres, whence they proceeded overland to Cordoba. The year following they set out for Paraguay, where Father Field and his companions laid the foundation of the Jesuit Commonwealth of Misiones, which had such wonderful development in the following 2 centuries as to cause Voltaire to admit that, "the Jesuit establishment in Paraguay seems to be the triumph of humanity." Another Irish Jesuit, Father Thaddeus Ennis, appears in authority in Misiones shortly before the downfall. In 1756, when Spain ceded San Miguel and other missions to Portugal, Father Ennis was entrusted with the removal lower down to Parana of such tribes as refused to become Portuguese subjects. Yet another Jesuit, Father Falconer, son of an Irish Protestant doctor in Manchester, who had himself studied medicine, was one of the most successful travelers and missionaries of the 18th century. Among his friends in London was a ship captain who traded from the coast of Guinea to Brazil, carrying slaves for the company recently established by Queen Anne's patent, and he it doubtless was who prevailed on the young physician to try a seafaring life. In one of his voyages as ship surgeon, from Guinea to Buenos Ayres, he fell ill at the latter port, and, there being no hotels, he had the good fortune to enjoy the hospitality of the Jesuit superior, Father Mahony, whose name proclaims his Irish nationality. Such was the impression made on Falconer by the kindness of the Jesuits, that he shortly afterwards was received into the church and entered as a novice in the College of St. Ignatius at Buenos Ayres. He spent the first years of his missionary career in Misiones and Tucumán. Later on he was dispatched by his superior to Patagonia, and his success there during 27 years was almost equal to what has already been mentioned of Father Field in Paraguay. He converted many tribes, and traversed nearly every part of Patagonia from Rio Negro to Magellan's Straits, and as far inland as the Andes. He knew most of the Indian tongues, and by his winning manners and knowledge of medicine gained a great influence over the savages. When he published his life and travels, such was the effect of his book upon the King of Spain that he at once ordered surveys and settlements to be made along the Patagonian coast, which Father Falconer represented as exposed to seizure by the first adventurer who should land there. Father Falconer's book has been translated into French, German, and Spanish. He returned to England and died at Spetchley, Worcestershire, near the end of the 18th century. In 1774 the Bishop of Ayacucho was Dr. James O'Fellan, who rebuilt the old Cathedral of Pasco. His father was an Irish officer in the Spanish army. 2. The War of Independence. Towards the close of the 18th century, the Pitt administration lent a willing ear to a Venezuelan patriot, General Miranda, who proposed that Great Britain should aid South America to expel the Spanish rulers and set up a number of independent states. Spain being the ally of France, and paying an annual subsidy to Napoleon, it became, moreover, the object of England to seize the treasure ships periodically arriving from the River Plate. Hostilities having broken out in Europe in 1803, an English squadron under an Irish commander, Captain Moore, captured in the following year some Spanish galleons laden with treasure at the mouth of the River Plate. In June 1806, Major General William Carr Beresford, with a British squadron, cast anchor about 12 miles from Buenos Ayres, and, with a force of only 1,635 men, took possession of that city of 60,000 inhabitants. The indignation which such a humiliation at first caused among the people was in large measure calmed by the manifesto which the conquering commander issued on the occasion. In the memoirs of General Belgrano we read, "It grieved me to see my country subjugated in this manner, but I shall always admire the gallantry of the brave and honorable Beresford in so daring an enterprise." Beresford was, however, unable to hold his ground, for the Spaniards got together an army of 10,000 men, and retook the city. Beresford was made prisoner, but after 5 months' detention, he and his brother officers, among whom was another Irishman, Major Fay, managed to escape. Thus ended the expedition of this brave general, who nevertheless had covered himself and his little army with glory, for he held Buenos Ayres as a British colony for 45 days, and had he been properly supported from home, the result would in all probability have been vastly different. General Beresford was one of the most distinguished men of his time. He was the illegitimate son of the Marquis of Waterford, entered the army at 16, and served in every quarter of the globe. After his defeat at Buenos Ayres, he captured Madeira, and was made governor of that island. In 1808 he successfully covered the retreat of Sir John Moore to Corunna, a difficult feat, for which he received a marshal's baton, and was made commander-in-chief in Portugal. In 1811 he defeated Marshal Soult at Albuera, and subsequently took part in the victories of Salamanca and Vittoria. For these services he was made Duke of Elvas, and the British government conferred on him in 1814 the title of Baron Beresford of Albuera and Dungannon. The same year he was sent as minister to Brazil, and on his return was created Viscount. He married the widow of Thomas Hope, the banker, and settled down on his estates in Kent, where he died in 1854. The brilliancy of Beresford's achievement in capturing Buenos Ayres with a handful of men had dazzled the minds of English statesmen, who felt that 10,000 British troops were enough to subdue the whole of the vast continent of South America. In May, 1807, an expedition comprising several frigates and transports with 5,000 troops appeared off Montevideo from England. A month later, Lieutenant General Whitlock arrived with orders to assume the chief command, and among his officers were the gallant Irishman, Major Vandeleur, who commanded a wing of the 88th Regiment, and Lieutenant Colonel Nugent of the 38th. Whitlock endeavored but failed to retake Buenos Ayres. During the siege, a small detachment of Spanish troops under Colonel James Butler, after a terrific conflict, in which they sold their lives dearly, were all killed. Agreeably to Colonel Butler's request, his remains were buried on the spot he had so valiantly defended, and his tombstone was visible there until 1818. It is a remarkable fact that several of the South American countries, Mexico, Peru, and Chile, were governed by viceroys of Irish birth in the critical period preceding the independence, although Spanish law forbade such office to any but Spaniards born. It was in recognition of gallant services in Spain, in combination with the Duke of Wellington, that General O'Donoghue was made Viceroy of Mexico in 1821, but the elevation of the great Viceroy of Peru, Ambrose O'Higgins, was due to the splendid talents of administration already displayed by him during 20 years of service in Chile. He was born at Summerhill, County Meath, about 1730. An uncle of his was one of the chaplains at the court of Madrid, and at his expense O'Higgins was educated at a college in Cadiz. He then entered the Spanish Engineer Corps, and in 1769 was given the command of the commission sent to Chile to strengthen the fortifications of Valdivia. He was made Captain General of Chile in 1788, was subsequently created Marquis of Osorno, and in 1796 was nominated Viceroy of Peru, a position which he held until his death in 1801. The great Viceroy left only one son, Bernard O'Higgins, who succeeded General Carreras in the supreme command of the Patriot Army against the Spaniards in 1813. In 1817 O'Higgins took a principal part in the victory of Chacabuco and was almost immediately appointed Supreme Director of Chile, with dictatorial powers. During his administration, which lasted 6 years, he gave every proof of his fitness for the position. But alas, it was the misfortune of South America to surpass the republics of antiquity in the ingratitude shown towards its greatest benefactors. It is then not surprising to find that the father of his country, as O'Higgins is affectionately styled, was deposed by a military revolution and obliged to take refuge in Peru, from which country he never returned. General Miller and Lord Cochrane, in their memoirs, give frequent testimony to the honesty and zeal of Bernard O'Higgins. He was always treated as an honored guest in Lima, in which city he died on October 24, 1842. He left a son, Demetrio O'Higgins, a wealthy landowner, who contributed large sums for the Patriot Army against Spain. Among other Irish commanders in Chile and Peru, who during the War of Independence fought their way to dignity and rank, was General McKenna, the hero of Membrillar. He was born in 1771 at Clogher, County Tyrone. His mother belonged to the ancient Irish sept of O'Reilly, whose estates were confiscated after the fall of Limerick in 1691. General Thomond O'Brien, who won his spurs at the Battle of Chacabuco, seems to have been born in the south of Ireland about 1790. He joined the army of San Martin, and accompanied that general through the campaigns of Chile and Peru until the overthrow of the Spanish regime and the proclamation of San Martin as protector of Peru. On the day, July 28, 1821, when independence was declared at Lima, the Protector took in his hand the standard of Pizarro and said, quote, "This is my portion of the trophies." Unquote. Then, taking the state canopy of Pizarro, a kind of umbrella always borne over the viceroys in processions, he presented it to General O'Brien, saying, quote, "This is for the gallant comrade who fought so many years by my side in the cause of South America." Unquote. The inscription on the canopy, in O'Brien's hand, says that it was brought to Peru on Pizarro's second journey from Spain. Little did the viceroys think that its last owner would be an Irishman. General O'Connor, one of the most distinguished soldiers of the War of Independence, played an important part in the final victory of Ayachucho. For his gallantry on that day he was promoted to the rank of general by the Commander-in-Chief, General Bolivar. After the War of Independence he became Minister of War in Bolivia. General O'Connor went to South America as an ensign in the Irish Legion under General Devereux. He claimed direct descent from Roderick O'Connor, last King of Ireland, 1186. Captain Esmond also fought in the War of Independence. He was brother to the then Baronet, Sir Thomas Esmond, of County Wexford. In later years Captain Esmond was employed by the Peruvian government to report on some proposed canals at Tarapaca. The vessel in which he embarked was never more heard of. Colonel Charles Carroll had served in Spain, but joined the Chilean army after independence was gained. He was one of the most popular officers in the army, and met with a sad fate. Being sent with too small a detachment against the savage Indians, their commander, Benavides, cut his forces in pieces, and murdered all the officers in a most cruel manner. O'Carroll had his tongue cut out and was then butchered. Lieutenant Colonel Moran, who commanded the Colombian Legion at the Battle of Ayachucho, probably came out in the Legion of General Devereux. Colonel, afterwards General O'Leary, was first aide-de-camp to General Bolivar, the Liberator, and received his last breath. He was nephew to the famous Father Arthur O'Leary. Bolivar employed him on various missions of great trust, and says, quote, "He acquitted himself with great ability." Unquote. After the war, General O'Leary was appointed British Chargé d'Affaires in Bogota, and died in Rome in 1868. General Arthur Sandys, a native of Dublin, was entrusted with an important garrison in Peru on the close of the War of Independence. Admiral Brown, the distinguished commander and hero of the War of Independence, whose exploits may be ranked, like those of Nelson, above all Greek, above all Roman fame, was born at Foxford, County Mayo, in Ireland, on the 22nd of June, 1777. His father emigrated with his family to Pennsylvania. A ship captain who was about to sail from Philadelphia offered to take the intelligent Irish boy with him, and the offer was promptly accepted. During 20 years he seems to have voyaged to many countries. At one time we find him at Archangel. Brown had been in Buenos Aires just 2 years when the Patriot government offered him command of a squadron to commence hostilities against the Spanish Navy, then mistress of all the coasts and waters of South America. On the memorable 8th of March, 1814, Brown sailed out of the port of Buenos Aires with 3 ships to commence a campaign which was destined to destroy the Spanish Navy in this part of the waters of the New World. With him went his fellow countrymen, Captains Seaver and Kearney. Brown's next exploits were against Spanish shipping in the Pacific, and his entirely successful campaign at sea against Brazil, in which he gained the mastery by his wonderful skill, courage, and perseverance, keeping at bay the great naval power of that country, which consisted at one time of 50 war vessels, with his few, small, ill-supplied, and ill-armed craft. After these great exploits, Brown spent some months among the wild scenery of Mayo, so dear to him in boyhood, and, returning to Buenos Aires, devoted himself to the quiet life of a country gentleman. He died surrounded by his family and friends on May 3, 1857, and the day of his funeral was one of national mourning. His widow erected a monument to his memory in the Recoleta Cemetery, and in 1872 the municipality of Buenos Aires granted a site for a public statue on the Paseo Julio, which so often rang with the plaudits of the people as they welcomed this great Irishman returning from victory. No brighter pages occur in the history of the New World than those which commemorate the gallantry and self-devotion of the Irish soldiers who aided South Americans to throw off the yoke of Spain. In 1819 an Irish legion of 1,729 men arrived under the command of General Devereux, a Wexford landowner, called the Lafayette of South America, to fight in the campaign of General Bolivar. Devereux was distinguished for his great bravery. After the War of Independence he returned to Europe, being commissioned to form a company for mining operations in Colombia, which country had appointed him envoy extraordinary to various European courts. Colonel Ferguson and Captain Talbot were both Irishmen, and among the last survivors of Devereux's legion. It is computed that 1/3 of the Irishmen who came out under General Devereux died in hospital. It was this legion which won the decisive battle of Carabobo, June 26, 1821, going into action 1,100 strong, and leaving 600 on that hard-fought field. Among the officers who composed Bolivar's Albion Rifles, we find the Irish names of Piggott, Talon, Peacock, Felon, O'Connell, McNamara, Fanshawe, French, Reynolds, Byrne, and Haig, and the medical officer was Dr. O'Reilly. We find mention in General Millar's memoirs of Dr. Moore, an Irishman, who attended Bolivar in most of his campaigns, and was devotedly attached to the person of the Liberator. Lieutenant Colonel Hughes, Major Maurice Hogan, Lieutenant William Keogh, Captain Lawrence McGuire, Lieutenant Colonel S. Collins also served in the struggle for independence. The period of independence found a small number of Irish residents in Buenos Aires, mostly patrician families, such as Dillon, McMurrough, Murphy, French, O'Gorman, Orr, Butler, and O'Shea, who had been exiled or had fled from Ireland and obtained the King of Spain's permission to settle in Spanish America. The descendants of these families are now so intermarried in the country that they have mostly forgotten the language and traditions of their ancestors, but they occupy high positions in political, legal, and commercial circles. 3. The period after the Declaration of Independence. A remarkable influx of settlers from Ireland occurred between 1825 and 1830 to work in the saladeros or salt mines of the Irish merchants Brown, Dowdall, and Armstrong. Previous to this, a few Irish mechanics and others had come from the United States. In 1813, Bernard Kieran came from New Brunswick. He seems to have devoted himself to science, as the papers mention his discovery of a comet in the Magellan Clouds on March 19, 1830. His son, James Kiernan, became editor of the government paper, Gazzetta Mercantile, in 1823, and held this post for 20 years. His death occurred in 1857. There is reason to believe that the first Irishman who landed in Buenos Aires in the 19th century, exclusive of Beresford's soldiers, was James Coelho, a native of Tyrone, who came in the Agréable in 1807 and died in 1876 at the age of 86. In 1830, some survivors of an Irish colony of 300 persons in Brazil made their way to Buenos Aires. They had come out from Europe on the bark Reward in 1829. The banker, Thomas Armstrong, who arrived in Buenos Aires in 1817, occupied the foremost place for half a century in the commerce of that city. He was of the ancient family of Armstrong in the King's County, one of whose members was General Sir John Armstrong, founder of Woolwich Arsenal. Having married into the wealthy family of Villanueva, he became intimately connected with all the leading enterprises of the day, such as railways, banks, loans, etc. He took no part in politics, but interested himself in charities of every kind. In 1865, another Irishman, James P. Cahill, introduced into Peru from the United States the first complete machinery for sugar growing and refining. Still another Irishman, Peter Sheridan, was one of the chief founders of the sheep farming industry in Argentina. His family claimed descent from the same stock in County Cavan as Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the great statesman and dramatist. Sheridan died at the age of 52 in 1844, and was succeeded in the estancia, or sheep farming business, by his nephew James, whose brother, Dr. Hugh Sheridan, had served under Admiral Brown. The number and wealth of the Irish estancieros, or sheep farmers, in Argentina have never been exactly ascertained, but after the old Spanish families they are the most important. It would be impossible to give all the Irish names to be met with. Some of them own immense tracts of land. Men whose fathers arrived in Argentina without a shilling are today worth millions. Their estancia houses display all the comforts of an American or English home. Their hospitality is proverbial, and most of them have built on their land fine schools and beautiful little chapels, in which the nearest Irish priest officiates. Many of the partidos or districts of the various provinces of Argentina may be compared to Irish counties, the railway stations being called after the owners of the land on which they are situated. Among the earliest families settled in Argentina in the farming industries, we find Dugans, Torneys, Harringtons, O'Briens, Dowlings, Gaynors, Murphys, Moores, Dillons, O'Rourkes, Kennys, Raths, Caseys, Norrises, O'Farrells, Browns, Hams, Duffys, Ballasties, Gayans, and Garrigans. Dr. Santiago O'Farrell, son of one of the earliest Irish pioneers, holds a foremost position among the distinguished lawyers of the present day. An Irish engineer, Mr. John Coghlan, gave Buenos Aires its first waterworks. The British hospital has at present for its leading surgeon a distinguished Irishman, Dr. Luke O'Connor. A son of Peter Sheridan, educated in England, has left the finest landscapes of South America by any artist born in America. He died at Buenos Aires in his 27th year, 1861. Among the public men of Irish descent 50 years ago in Buenos Aires are to be mentioned the distinguished lawyer and politician Dalmacio Velez Sarsfield and John Dillon, Commissioner of Immigration. Dillon was the first to start a brewery in Buenos Aires, for which purpose he brought out workmen and machinery from Europe. All of his sons occupied distinguished positions. Richard O'Shea, president of the Chamber of Commerce in Buenos Aires, was born at Seville of an old Irish family banished by William III. Among the many valuable citizens of Buenos Aires who perished during the cholera of 1868 was Dr. Leslie, a native of Cavan, whose benevolence to the poor was unceasing. Henry O'Gorman, for some years chief of police in Buenos Aires, and afterwards governor of the penitentiary, was descended from an Irish family which went to Buenos Aires in the 18th century. His brother, Canon O'Gorman, was one of the dignitaries of the archdiocese, and director of the Boys' Reformatory. General Donovan, son of an Irish Dr. Donovan of Buenos Aires, had command of one of the sections of the new Indian frontier. The first Irish chaplain was Father Burke, a venerable friar mentioned by Mr. Love in 1820 as over 70 years of age and much esteemed. When Rivadavia suppressed the orders in 1822, he allowed Father Burke to remain in the convent of Santo Domingo. After his death, the Irish residents in 1828 petitioned Archbishop Murray of Dublin for a chaplain. Accordingly, the Rev. Patrick Moran was selected, and he arrived in Buenos Aires in 1829. He died in the following year, and was succeeded by the Rev. Patrick O'Gorman from Dublin, who continued as chaplain during 16 years till his death in 1847. The year 1843 is memorable for the arrival of Rev. Anthony Fahey, with whose name the advancement of the Irish in Argentina will be forever identified. This great patriarch was born at Loughrea, County Galway, in 1804, and made his ecclesiastical studies at St. Clement's Convent of Irish Dominicans at Rome. Being sent to the Western States of America, he passed 10 years in Ohio and Kentucky, after which, on the invitation of the Irish community of Buenos Aires, and by permission of the superior of his order, he came to the River Plate at a time when the prospects of the country and the Irish residents were far from promising. The history of the Irish community since that time is in some measure a recital of the labors of Father Fahey. He it was who helped his countrymen to choose and buy their lands, which are now of such enormous value. Their increasing numbers and prosperity in the camp districts obliged him to endow each of the provincial partidos with a resident chaplain. Most of these clergymen were educated in Dublin and soon showed their zeal not merely in religious but also in social spheres. Irish reading rooms, libraries, and schools sprang up and laid the foundation for the refined Irish life of the present day in those districts. Among other services, Father Fahey founded the Irish Convent, bringing out some Sisters of Mercy under Mrs. Mary Evangelist Fitzpatrick from Dublin, to whom he gave it in charge. Father Fahey died in harness in 1871 of yellow fever. He attended a poor Italian woman, and on returning home was at once taken ill. He lasted only 3 days and expired peacefully, a martyr to his sacred calling. He died so poor that Mr. Armstrong had to discharge for him some small debts, and 5 others of his countrymen paid his funeral expenses. A fitting memorial of the deceased priest, the Fahey College for Irish Orphan Boys in Argentina, has been erected in Buenos Aires, and a magnificent monument of Irish marble carved in Ireland also perpetuates his fame. The priests still living who were co-workers with Father Fahey and appointed by him to various partidos are Monsignor Samuel O'Reilly, deservedly beloved by his parishioners, and the Reverend Father Flannery, whose appointment to San Pedro brought a great influx of Irish farmers into that district. Among those who have gone to enjoy their eternal reward are the brothers, Reverend Michael and Reverend John Leahy, both of whom were indefatigable during the yellow fever in Buenos Aires. Reverend Father Mulady, Reverend Patrick Lynch, Reverend James Curran, and Monsignor Curley were also among the Irish priests of that time. The Fahey College is entrusted to the care of the Marist brothers, who are largely Irish. the community of Holy Cross of the Passionist Fathers, who have as provincial the distinguished North American scholar Father Fidelis Kent Stone, is almost entirely composed of Irish and Irish Americans. They have several establishments in various provinces of Argentina. Irish priests are to be met with all over the country. In Patagonia and the Chaco, we also find a number of Protestant missionaries sent out by the Irish branch of the South American Missionary Society. Archdeacon Dillon succeeded Father Fahey as Irish chaplain in Buenos Aires, and, although by birth and education an Irishman, he became one of the principal dignitaries of the archdiocese. He was for some time professor of theology in the Ecclesiastical Seminary of Buenos Aires, and accompanied Archbishop Escalada as theologian to the Vatican Council in 1869. He was the founder of the Southern Cross in 1874. The Irish weekly paper which is now so ably edited by the gifted Irishman, Mr. Gerald Foley. The first daily paper to appear in English in South America was the Standard, founded in 1861 by Michael G. Mulhall, the distinguished statistician, and is still one of the leading papers in the country. In conducting it, Michael G. Mulhall was joined by his brother Edward T. Mulhall in 1862, and for many years it was continuously under their care. The Standard still remains in the Mulhall family, and has for its editor a cousin of the former editors, Mr. John Mulhall, who wisely directs its course. The Argentina, an important paper in Spanish, was founded a few years since by Edward T. Mulhall, Jr., a brilliant son of the late Edward Mulhall of the Standard. The Hiberno Argentine Review, a new Irish weekly, is edited by another able Irishman, James B. Sheridan. In Rio Janeiro, the Anglo-Brazilian Times was founded in 1864 by an Irishman, Mr. Scully, who also wrote an important book on Brazil. Ireland had also its representatives in South American diplomacy and the making of treaties. As early as 1809, Colonel James Burke was sent by Lord Strangford, British minister at Rio, on a confidential mission to Buenos Aires to negotiate the establishment of a separate kingdom on the River Plate with the Princess Charlotte as queen. In 1867 Mr. Gould, an Irishman, British chargé d'affaires, endeavored to mediate between the allies Brazil and Argentina, and President Lopez of Paraguay, but without success. Stephen H. Sullivan, British chargé d'affaires for Chile, signed the Treaty of Commerce and Navigation between England and Chile on the 10th of May, 1852. He was afterwards appointed British minister at Lima, where he was murdered. The late Chilean ministers to Buenos Aires and London, William Blest Gana and Albert Blest Gana, were the sons of an Irish Dr. Blest from Sligo, who settled in Chile. In 1859, George Fagan signed a treaty with General Guido for compensation of losses to British subjects during the civil wars after the independence. The mining industry had among its pioneers brave sons of Erin. J.O. French went to Buenos Aires in 1826, and after an arduous mountain journey arrived at the foot of the Cerro Morado, where he found auriferous ores. Chevalier Edmund Temple, an Irish gentleman who had served in Spain in a dragoon regiment, also landed in Buenos Aires in 1826 and started across the Pampas, then almost uninhabited, until he came to the mountainous country where the Potosi mines were situated. In one of the defiles he lost his favorite horse, and in his book he bids a touching farewell to the friendly steed which had shared with him so many toils and dangers. Temple's successor in the Argentine mining provinces was Major Richard Seaver, a member of an old County Dublin family. Several books of travel in South America have been published by Irish writers during the last 50 years. McCann's Travels in the Argentine Provinces, 1846-49, contains much that is valuable concerning the history and manners of the country. Major Richard Seaver issued in 1863 an interesting narrative of his crossing the Andes. Consul Hutchinson, an Irishman, published in 1864 his book Argentine Gleanings, which was followed by another in 1869 called South American Recollections. Robert Crawford, an Irish engineer, led an expedition from Buenos Aires in November, 1871, across the Indian Pampas and over the pass of the Planchon in the Andes, to survey an overland route to Chile, and subsequently published an interesting account of his journey. The first book printed and published in English in South America was the Handbook of the River Plate, written by Michael G. Mulhall, and published by the Standard in 1861. The same author also published the Rural Code of Buenos Aires in 1867 and the Handbook of Brazil in 1877. In 1871 he published an account of his travels among the German colonies in Rio Grande do Sul. 20 years ago the writer of this sketch published Between the Amazon and the Andes and The Story of the Jesuit Missions of Paraguay. These books derive special interest from the fact that she was the first foreign woman ever seen in Coyaba, the capital of Mato Grosso, whither she accompanied her husband 2,500 miles from either the Atlantic or the Pacific seaboard. They arrived as far as the Diamantina Mountains beyond Coyaba and saw the little rivers which form the sources of the mighty Amazon. Casting a glance over South America, we see in every country and province evidences of Irish genius employed not only in fighting, but in the development of natural resources. To quote Consul Cooper's report to the Foreign Office in London, "The progress of Buenos Aires is mainly due to the industrious Irish sheep farmers." No other nationality contributed so largely to the export trade of the country. At one time it was shown by the tables of Mr. Dugan and other wool exporters that the quantity of this staple industry yearly sold by Irishmen in Buenos Aires exceeded that sold by all other nationalities. In later years the Irish sheep farmers in the province of Buenos Aires have turned their lands into wheat lands, and the great industries of the country, sheep and cattle, have been moved to the outside camps, especially to that wonderful grazing region in the Andine valleys recently visited by Colonel Roosevelt and his party. It may be interesting to mention that at the first English races ever held in South America, on November 6, 1826, the principal event, in which 10 horses ran, was easily won by an Irish horse with the appropriate name of Shamrock. References: Beaumont, Travels in Buenos Aires, 1828. Wilson, Travels in South America, 1796. Pinkerton, Travels, 1808. Captain Waddell, Cape Horn and South Atlantic Surveys. Major Gillespie, Buenos Aires and Provinces. Mrs. Williams, on Humboldt's Travels, 1826. Captain Master, At Home with the Patagonians, 1891. Hadfield, Notes of Travel in Brazil and La Plata, 1863. Hinchcliffe, South American Sketches, 1862. Captain Burton, Highlands of Brazil. Ross Johnston, A Vacation in the Argentine Alps, 1867. McCann, Travels in the Argentine Provinces, 1846 to 1849. Hutchinson, Argentine Gleanings and South American Recollections. Major Seaver, Crossing the Andes. Crawford, Across the Pampas. V. McKenna, Life of O'Higgins. Life of Diego Remagro. History of Santiago. History of Valparaiso. McKenna, Archives of Spanish America, 50 volumes. Miller, Memoirs. Lives of Belgrano and San Martin. Mulhall, English in South America. End of section 24. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Section 25 of The Glories of Ireland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jenny Adamson. The Glories of Ireland, edited by Joseph Dunn and P.J. Lennox. Section 25. The Irish in Australasia, by Brother Leo, FSc, M.A. Should one be called upon to give in brief the history of the Irish in the land of the Southern Cross, he could do nothing more to the purpose than to relate the story of the Holy House of Australia. The episode, indeed, is characteristic not merely of the Irish in Australia, but of the Irish in every land and clime where they have striven and conquered. On the 14th of November, 1817, there landed in Sydney an Irish Cistercian father, Jeremiah F. Flynn. He had heard in Rome of the spiritual destitution of the Irish Catholics in Australia, and he secured the permission of his superiors to minister to the needs of his compatriots in the Antipodes. Shortly after his arrival he celebrated Mass in the house of an Irishman named William Davis, who had been transported for making pikes for the insurgents in the days of '98, and then, on the first opportunity that presented itself, he sought the authorization of the colonial governor to exercise the functions of his sacred ministry. Far from hospitable was the reception accorded him by Governor Macquarie. The priest was told, with the bluntness characteristic of British officialdom, that the presence of no popish missionary would be tolerated in the settlement, and that the profession of the Protestant form of belief was obligatory on every person in the penal colony. With the example of the priesthood hunted down like wolves before him, Father Flynn saw but one consistent course to pursue. His fellow Catholics, his fellow Irishmen, were in sore need of his help. That help they must receive, even though the civil powers refused their sanction. So for several months he went about as secretly as he could, hearing confessions, offering the holy sacrifice, and breaking the bread of good counsel. During this trying period, Davis was his host and defender and friend. Eventually the presence of the priest was detected. He was arrested and promptly sent back to England. Before the ship sailed, he tried repeatedly to return to the house of Davis, where the Blessed Sacrament was preserved in a cedar clothes press, but the surveillance of his captors was strict and unsleeping. So in the dwelling of the convict Irishman the sacred species remained. Before this unwonted repository Davis kept a light ever burning day and night, and day and night crept the loyal Irishmen of the settlement to kneel in prayer before the impoverished shrine. The Holy House of Australia, as the Davis dwelling came to be known, remained the only Catholic church in the colony until 1821, when two Irish priests, Father John Joseph Terry of Cork and Father Philip Connolly of Kildare, were permitted to attend to the spiritual needs of the Irish Catholics. Their coming marked the beginning of religious toleration in Australia and the termination of the sufferings and sacrifices of the Irish colonists, several of whom had had to pay dearly for their religious convictions. Davis himself had been twice flogged and once imprisoned for refusing to attend Protestant service. Today, on the site of the Holy House of Australia, stands the Church of St. Patrick. Davis gave the land and the sum of £1,000 to the church, and his fellow exiles contributed according to their means. This episode in the history of the Irish in Australia pays a touchingly eloquent tribute to the spirit of loyalty to God and country which has characterized the sons and daughters of St. Patrick everywhere whither their feet have strayed. It is the spirit which has made the Irish play so conspicuous a role in the civic and commercial history of Australasia. Originally known as New Holland, Australia became an English penal colony after the outbreak of the Revolutionary War in the United States of America. An Irish element came into the colony in the last decade of the 18th century when, during the Orange Reign of Terror, upwards of 1,000 people from the west of Ireland were deported by the Ulster magistrates and by Lord Corhampton, the notorious Satanides, who was charged with the pacification of Connaught. And during the first 3 decades of the 19th century the stream of Irish transportation flowed on. As a result of the Tithes agitation, the Charter and Reform movements, the Combination Laws and the Corn Laws, many more Irishmen were forced across the sea. It was not until 1868 that the convict system was permanently abolished. It is difficult for us of a later day to realize the meaning of that word, transportation. Let us form some conception of what the Irish exiles suffered from the graphic picture painted in colours, sombre but not untrue, by one who knew from first-hand experience the lot of the political prisoner. Writes Dr. Ullathorne in The Horrors of Transportation, "Take any one of you, my dear readers, separate him from his wife, from his children, from all those whose conversation makes life dear to him. Cast him on the ends of the earth. Let him there fall among reprobates who are the last stain and disgrace of our common nature. Give him those obscene-mouthed monsters for his constant companions and consolers. Let the daily vision of their progress from infamy to infamy, until the demon that inspires them has exhausted invention and the powers of nature together, be his only example. House him at night in a bark hut on a mud floor, where he has less comfort than your cattle in their stalls. Awake him from the troubled dreams of his wretched wife and outcast children, to feel how far he is from their help, and take him out at sunrise, work him under a burning sun and a heartless overseer, and the threat of the lash until the nightfall. Give him not a penny's wages but sorrow. Leave him no hope but the same dull, dreary round of endless drudgery for many years to come. Let him see no opening by which to escape, but through a long, narrow prospect of police courts, of jails, of triangles, of death cells, and of penal settlements. Let him all the while be clothed in a dress of shame that shows to every living soul his degradation. And if he dare to sell any part of that clothing, then flog him worse than any dog. And thus, whilst severed from all kindness and all love, whilst the stern harsh voice of his taskmaster is grating in incessant jars within his ear, take all rest out of his flesh, and plant the thorn. Take all feeling out of his heart, and leave the withered core. Take all peace out of his conscience, and leave the worm of remorse. And then let any one come and dare to tell me that the man is happy because he has bread and meat. Is it not here, if ever there was such a case, where the taste of bread is a taste of misery, and where to feed in prolonged life is to feed and lengthen our sorrow? And in pondering these things, do not those strong words of sacred scripture bring down their load of truth in heavy trouble to our thoughts, that their bread is loathsome to their eye, and their meat unto their soul? But the bright side of the story of the Irish in Australia and New Zealand unfolds in the subsequent years. The men who had been sent forth from Erin with the brand of the convict upon them became the founders of a new commonwealth. To them were joined the numerous voluntary settlers who, attracted by the natural resources of the island continent, and especially by the gold discoveries of the 50s, migrated to Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales. When in 1858 William E. Gladstone sought to establish a new colony to be known as North Australia, he opened a fresh field for Irish initiative. As a result of his effort, there stands today, on a terrace overlooking Port Curtis, the city of Gladstone, the terminal of the Australian railway system. It was here, according to Cardinal Moran, that in 1606 Mass was first celebrated in Australia, when the Spaniards sought shelter in the harbour of the Holy Cross. The first government resident at Gladstone was Sir Maurice Charles O'Connell, a relative of the great liberator. He was 4 times acting governor of Queensland. The list of Irish pioneer settlers in Australasia is a lengthy one. The name of Thomas Poynton stands out prominently. He was a New Zealand pioneer who had married an Irish girl in Sydney. The devotion of Poynton and his wife to the faith of their fathers is evidenced by the fact that he several times made the long journey from his home to Sydney to interest the church authorities in the wants of the New Zealand Irish Catholics, and that she twice made the same arduous trip to have her children baptized. Thomas Mooney has the distinction of being the first Irish pioneer in Western Australia, and yet another Irishman, Cassidy by name, carried out a policy of benevolent assimilation by marrying the daughter of a Maori chief. Among the pioneer ecclesiastics were Father William Kelly of Melbourne and Father John McEncroe, a native of Tipperary and a Maynooth man, who for 30 years and more was a prominent figure in the religious and civic life of New South Wales. Father John Brady, another pioneer priest, became Bishop of Perth. Irish names occupy a conspicuous and honoured place in the roster of the Australian episcopate. Notable on the list are Bishop Francis Murphy of Adelaide, who was born in County Meath, and Archbishop Daniel Murphy of Sydney, a native of Cork, the man who delivered the eulogy on the occasion of Daniel O'Connell's funeral at Rome. But scant reference can here be made to the illustrious primate of Australia, Cardinal Moran, Archbishop of Sydney from 1884 to 1911, who was such a potent force in the land of his adoption, and whose masterly History of the Catholic Church in Australasia puts him in the forefront of ecclesiastical historians. On his death he was succeeded in the see of Sydney by another Irishman, Archbishop Michael Kelly of Waterford. Archbishop O'Reilly of Adelaide is a recognised authority on music, and has written several pamphlets on that subject. A Galway man, Dr. T.J. Carr, a great educator, is now, 1914, Archbishop of Melbourne, and Clare man, Dr. J.P. Clune, holds sway in Perth. Irish men in Australia have figured largely in the iron and coal industries, in the irrigation projects, in the manufacturing activities, and in the working of the gold mines. But they have likewise distinguished themselves in other fields of endeavour. Prominent on the bead roll of Australian fame stands the names of Sir Charles Gavan Duffy, 1816 to 1903, founder of the Nation newspaper in Dublin, member of the British House of Commons, and afterwards Premier of Victoria and Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, and his sons, John Gavan Duffy and Frank Gavan Duffy, public-spirited citizens and authorities on legal matters. The Currans, father and son, active in the public life of Sydney, were afterwards members of the British Parliament. Distinguished in the records of the Australian judiciary are Judges Quinlan, Casey, Brennan and O'Dowd. The Reverend J. Milne Curran, FGS, is a geologist who has achieved more than local fame. Other Irishmen who have loomed large in Australasian affairs are Daniel Brophy, John Cumin, Augustus Leo Kenny, James Coughlin, Sir Patrick Buckley, Sir John O'Shanassy, and Nicholas Fitzgerald. Louis C. Brennan, C.B., who was born in Ireland in 1852, emigrated to Australia when a boy and, while working in a civil engineer's office in Melbourne, conceived the idea of the Brennan torpedo, which he afterwards perfected, and then, in 1897, sold the invention to the British Admiralty for £110,000. Another Brennan, Frank by name, is president of the Knights of Our Lady of the Southern Cross, and has been a Labour member of the Federal Parliament since 1911. A third, Christopher John, is assistant lecturer in modern literature in the University of Sydney, and a fourth, James, of the Diocese of Perth, was made a Knight of St. Sylvester by Pius X in 1912. Young Australia and New Zealand may be as the world goes, but already both have much to their credit in the domains of music, art and literature, and here, as usual, the Irish have been to the fore. In the writing of poetry, history and fiction the Celtic element has been especially distinguished. Not to speak of the writers mentioned elsewhere in this sketch, scores of Irish men and women have been identified with the development of an Australian literature which, though delightfully redolent of the land whence it sprang, nevertheless possesses the universal note which makes it a truly human product. Many years ago, one of the most gifted of Irish Australian singers, Eva of the Nation, voiced a tentative plaint. O barren land, O blank bright sky, methinks it were a noble duty to kindle in that vacant eye the light of spirit, beauty, to fill with airy shapes divine thy lonely plains and mountains, the orange grove, the bower of vine, the silvery lakes and fountains, to wake the voiceless, silent air to soft melodious numbers, to raise thy lifeless form so fair from those deep spellbound slumbers. O, whose shall be the potent hand to give that touch informing, and make thee rise, O southern land, to life and poesy warming? Mrs. O'Doherty herself, who long lived in that Queensland which she thus apostrophised, helped in no uncertain way to answer her own question. So did John Farrell, the author of the truly remarkable Jubilee Ode of 1897 and of a collection of poems which include the well-known How He Died. And so, long before, had the non-Catholic Irishman, Edward O'Shaughnessy, who went to Australia as a convict but who laughed in lockstep and made music with his chains. James Francis Hogan, author and journalist, was born in Tipperary in 1855, and shortly afterward was brought by his parents to Melbourne, where he received his education. On his return to Ireland, he was elected to represent his native country in Parliament. He is an authority on Australian history, and in his book on the Gladstone Colony has given us a fine specimen of modern historical method. With him must be mentioned Roderick Flanagan, whose History of New South Wales appeared in 1862. Other Irish names distinguished in Australasian literature are those of the New Zealand poet Thomas Bracken, Roderick Quinn, Desmond Byrne, J.B. O'Hara, the eccentric convict writer George Barrington Waldron, Victor J. Daly, Bernard O'Dowd, Edwin J. Brady, the Reverend J. J. Malone, and the Reverend W. Kelly. Finally, the Irish in Australia have done more than their share in the work of education and social service. Under Irish auspices, several of the Catholic teaching congregations, including the Christian Brothers and the Presentation Nuns, were introduced, and their work has borne goodly fruit. A mighty power for good is the Hibernian Australasian Benefit Society. The organisation, which was founded in 1871, has spread rapidly and has a large active membership. Truly, the land of the Southern Cross is not the dimmest jewel in the coronet of Ireland's glories. References: Hogan, The Irish in Australia, 1888. The Gladstone Colony, 1898. Mennell, Dictionary of Australian Biography, 1892. Duffy, Life in Two Hemispheres, 1903. Kenny, The Catholic Church in Australia to the year 1840. Moran, History of the Catholic Church in Australasia, 1898. Davitt, Life and Progress in Australasia, 1898. Bonwick, The First 20 Years of Australia, 1883. Flanagan, History of New South Wales, 1862. Byrne, Australian Writers, 1896. Wilson, The Church in New Zealand, 1910. Hocken, A Bibliography of the Literature Relating to New Zealand, 1909. End of section 25. Recording by Jenny Adamson.
Section 26 of the Glories of Ireland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Glories of Ireland. Edited by Joseph Dunn and P.J. Lennox. The Irish in South Africa by A. Millard Atteridge. The tide of emigration from Ireland has set chiefly towards America and Australia. In South Africa, therefore, the Irish element among the colonists has never been a large one. But despite its comparatively small numbers, it has been an important factor in the life of South Africa. Here, as in so many other countries, it has been the glory of the sons of Aaron to be a missionary people. To their coming is due the very existence of the Catholic Church in these southern lands. When Dr. Ullathorne touched at the Cape on his way to Australia in 1832, he found at Cape Town a single priest for the whole of South Africa, an English Benedictine, who soon afterwards returned to Europe in broken health. Few Irish immigrants had by that time found their way to the Cape. They began to arrive in numbers only after the famine year. The founder of the Catholic hierarchy in South Africa was the Irish Dominican Patrick R. Griffith, who in 1837 was sent to Cape Town by Gregory XVI as the first Vicar Apostolic of Cape Colony. His successors at the Cape, Bishops Grimley, Leonard, and Rooney, have all been Irishmen, and 9 in every 10 of their flock have from the first been Irish by birth or descent. In the earlier years of Bishop Griffith's episcopate, there was a large garrison in South Africa on account of the Kafir Wars. Many of these soldiers were Irishmen. At Grahamstown in 1844, the soldiers of an Irish regiment stationed there did most of the work of building St. Patrick's Church, one of the oldest Catholic churches in South Africa. They worked without wages or reward of any kind, purely out of their devotion to their faith, giving up most of their leisure to this voluntary labor. 10 years after Bishop Griffith's appointment, Pius IX separated Natal and the eastern districts of Cape Colony from Cape Town and erected the Eastern Vicariate Apostolic. Once more, an Irish prelate was the first bishop, Aidan Devereux, who was consecrated by Bishop Griffith at Cape Town in the Christmas week of 1847. The great emigration from Ireland had now begun, and a stream of immigrants was arriving at the Cape. Bishop Devereux fixed his residence at Port Elizabeth, and of his 4 successors up to the present day, 3 have been Irish. Bishop Moran, who went out to Port Elizabeth in 1854, was consecrated at Carlow in Ireland by Archbishop, afterwards Cardinal Cullen. The 3rd Vicar Apostolic was Bishop Reichard's, and the present bishop is another Irishman, Dr. Hugh McSherry, who received his consecration from the hands of Cardinal Logue at St. Patrick's Cathedral at Armagh. Until the discovery of the diamond deposits in what is now the Kimberley district some 40 years ago, the Irish immigrants had chiefly settled in the ports and along the coast. But among the crowds who went to seek their fortunes at the diamond fields were large numbers of adventurous Irishmen. The mission church, established at Kimberley, became the center of a new bishopric in 1886, when the Vicariate of Kimberley, which for some time included the Orange Free State, was established, and an Irish oblate, Father Anthony Guerin, was appointed its first bishop. He was succeeded in 1901 by his namesake and fellow countryman, the present Bishop Matthew Guerin. The gold discoveries on the Witwatersrand about Johannesburg produced another rush into the interior in the days after the First Transvaal War. A great city of foreign immigrants, the Uitlanders, grew up rapidly on the upland, where a few months before there had been only a few scattered Boer farms. Irishmen from Cape Colony and Natal, from Ireland itself, and from the United States, formed a large element in the local mining and trading community. They were mostly workers. Few of them found their way into the controlling financier class, which was largely Jewish. The Irish were better out of the circle of international gamblers, whose intrigues finally produced the terrible 2 years' bloodshed of the great South African War. Many engineers of the mines were Irish Americans. Huge consignments of mining machinery arrived from the United States, and many of the engineers who came to fit it up remained in the employ of the mining companies. Until after the war, the Transvaal and Johannesburg had depended ecclesiastically on the Vicar Apostolic of Natal, but in 1904 a Transvaal Vicariate was erected, and once more the first bishop was an Irishman, Dr. William Miller, OMI. We have seen how Irish the South African episcopate has been from the very outset. Most of the clergy belong to the same missionary race, as also do the nuns of the various convents, and the Christian brothers who are in charge of many of the schools. Of the white Catholic population of the various states of the South African Union, the greater part are Irish. There are about 25,000 Irish in Cape Colony, in a total population of over 2 millions. There are some 7,000 in Natal, 1,500 in Kimberley, and about 2,000 in the Orange River Colony. In the Transvaal, chiefly in and about Johannesburg, there are some 12,000 Irish. A few thousand more are to be found scattered in Griqualand and Rhodesia. As has been already said, the total numbers are not large in proportion to that of the population generally, and they belong chiefly to the industrial and trading classes. The most notable names among them are those of prelates, priests, and missionaries, who have founded and built up the organization of the Catholic Church in South Africa. But there are some names of note also in civil life. Sir Michael Galway was for many years Chief Justice of Natal. The Honorable A. Wilmot, who has not only held high official posts, but has also done much to clear up the early history of South Africa, is Irish on the mother's side. Mr. Justice Shiel is a judge of the Cape Courts. Eyre and Woodbine are Irish names among the makers of Rhodesia. And amongst those who have done remarkable work in official life may also be named Sir Geoffrey Lagden, Sir William St. John Carr, and the Honourable John Daverin. Lagden was for many years British resident in Basutoland, the Switzerland of South Africa, where the native tribes are practically independent under a British protectorate. Griffith, the paramount chief of the Basuto nation, has been a Catholic since 1911. Sir Geoffrey's tactful policy and wise counsels did much to promote the prosperity of this native state, and during the trying days of the South African War, he was able to secure the neutrality of the tribesmen. In the Boer Wars, Irishmen fought with distinction on both sides. General Colley, who fell at Majuba in the First Boer War, was a distinguished Irish soldier. Another great Irishman, General Sir William Butler, has written the story of Colley's life. Butler himself was in command of the troops at the Cape before the Great War. If his wise counsels had been followed by the government, the war would undoubtedly have been avoided. He refused to have any part in the war-provoking policy of Rhodes and Chamberlain, and warned the home government that an attack on the Dutch republics would be a serious and perilous enterprise. When the war came, England owed much to the enduring valor of Irish soldiers and to the leadership of Irish generals. One need only name General Hart of the Irish Brigade, General French, who relieved Kimberley, and who is now, 1914, Field Marshal and Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in France, General Mann, who raised the siege of Mafeking, Colonel Moore of the famous Connaught Rangers, now, 1914, Commandant and Chief Military Advisor of the Irish National Volunteers, and finally Lord Roberts, who took over the chief command and saved the situation after the early disasters. Lord Kitchener, who acted as Roberts' chief of staff, succeeded him in the command and brought the war to an end by an honourable treaty with the Boer leaders, is a native of Ireland, but of English descent, and he passed most of his boyhood in Ireland, in County Kerry, where his father had bought a small property. I used to know an Irish Franciscan lay brother who told me he had taught the future soldier many games when he was quite a little fellow. Of the regiments which took part in the war, none won a higher fame than the Munster and the Dublin Fusiliers and the Connaught Rangers. It was in recognition of their splendid valor that the new regiment of Irish Guards was added to the British Army. But the majority of Irishmen sympathized with the Boer republics. and many of them fought under the Boer flag. Of these were legally British subjects, but many were naturalized burghers of the Transvaal, and many more were United States citizens, Irish Americans from the Rand gold mines. There were two small Irish brigades under the Boer flag, those of MacBride and Lynch, the latter now a member of the British House of Commons, and an engineer corps commanded by Colonel Blake, an American. At the very first battle before Ladysmith, it was one of the Irish brigades that kept the Boer guns in action, bringing up ammunition under a rain of shell fire. During the Boer retreat and Robert's advance on Pretoria, Blake's engineers were always with the Boer rear guard and successfully destroyed every mile of the railway as they went back. Blake had served in the United States cavalry, had learned mining while on duty in Nevada, and had then gone to seek his fortune in Johannesburg. The great leader of the Boer armies, now the Prime Minister of the new South Africa, which has happily arisen out of the storm of war, has Irish connections. Louis Botha lived before the war in the southeast Transvaal, not far from Laing's Nek, and near neighbors of his were a family of Irish settlers bearing the honored name of Emmet. The Emmets and the Bothas were united by ties of friendship and intermarriage, and one of the Emmets served with Louis Botha during the war. The Irish colonists of South Africa kept their love for faith and fatherland. But as in the United States, they have thoroughly and loyally thrown in their lot with the new country of which they have become citizens. Few in number though they are an important factor in the new dominion, for their national tradition inspires them with civic patriotism, and their religion gives them a high standard of conduct and puts before them, as guides in the work of life and the solution of the problems of the day, the Christian principles of justice and charity. References: Government Census Returns, South Africa. Catholic Directory for British South Africa, Cape Town, since 1904. The Catholic Magazine, Cape Town, Wilmot and Chase. History of Cape Colony, London, 1896. Teal, History of South Africa, 5 volumes, London, 1888 to 1893. For the war period, the Times History of the South African War and the British Official History. End of Chapter 26. Recording by John Brandon.
Section 27 of the Glories of Ireland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Glories of Ireland, edited by Joseph Dunn and P.J. Lennox. Section 27, Irish Language and Letters, by Douglas Hyde, LL.D., MRIA. The Celtic languages consist of 2 divisions, A, the Gaelic or Irish division, and B, the Cymric or Welsh division. Between them they comprise A, Irish, Scotch Gaelic, and Manx, and B, Welsh, Armorican, and Cornish. All these languages are still alive except Cornish, which died out about 100 years ago. Of all these languages, Irish is the best preserved, and it is possible to follow its written literature back into the past for some 1300 years, while much of the most interesting matter has come down to us from pagan times. It has left behind it the longest, the most luminous, and the most consecutive literary track of any of the vernacular languages of Europe except Greek alone. For centuries, the Irish and their language were regarded by the English as something strange and foreign to Europe. It was not recognized that they had any relationship with the Greeks or Romans, the French, the Germans, or the English. The once well-known statesman, Lord Lyndhurst, in the British Parliament, denounced the Irish as aliens in religion, in blood, and in language. Bopp, in his great comparative grammar, refused them recognition as Indo-Europeans, and Pott, in 1856, also denied their European connection. It was left for the great Bavarian scholar, John Caspar Zeuss, to prove to the world in his epoch-making Grammatica Celtica, published in Latin in 1853, that the Celts were really Indo-Europeans, and that their language was of the highest possible value and interest. From that day to the present, it is safe to say that the value set upon the Irish language and literature has been steadily growing amongst the scholars of the world, and that in the domain of philology, Old Irish now ranks close to Sanskrit for its truly marvelous and complicated scheme of word forms and inflections, and its whole verbal system. The exact place which the Celtic languages, of which Irish is philologically far the most important, hold in the Indo-European group has often been discussed. It is now generally agreed upon that, although both the Celtic and Teutonic languages may claim a certain kinship with each other, as being both of them Indo-European, still the Celtic is more nearly related to the Greek and the Latin groups, especially to the Latin. All the Indo-European languages are more or less related to one another. We Irish must acknowledge a relationship, or rather a very distant connecting tie, with English. But to trace this home, Irish must be followed back to the very oldest form of its words, and English must be followed back to Anglo-Saxon, and, when possible, to Gothic. The hard mutes p, t, k of Celtic, and for that matter of Sanskrit, Zend, Greek, Latin, Slavonic, and Lithuanian, will be represented in Gothic by the corresponding soft mutes b, d, g, and the soft mutes in Celtic by the corresponding hard mutes in Gothic. Thus we find the Irish dia, God, in the Anglo-Saxon Tiw, the god of war, whose name is perpetuated for all time in Tuisdag, now Tuesday, and we find the Irish Déad in the Anglo-Saxon Toth, now Tooth, and so on. But of all the Indo-European languages, Old Irish possesses by far the nearest affinity to Latin, and this is shown in a great many ways, not in the vocabulary merely, but in the grammar, which for philologists is of far more importance, as, for example, the be future, the passive in are, the genitive singular and nominative plural of o stems, etc. Thus the Old Irish for man, nominative fer, genitive fir, dative fir, accusative fern, plural nominative fir, genitive fern, is derived from the older forms viros, viri, viro, viron, nominative plural, viri, genitive plural, viron, which everyone who knows Latin can see at a glance correspond very closely to the Latin inflections vir, viri, viro, virum, nominative plural viri, etc. So much for the language. When did this language begin to be used in literature? This question depends upon another. When did the Irish begin to have a knowledge of letters? When did they begin to commit their literature to writing? And whence did they borrow their knowledge of this art? The oldest alphabet used in Ireland, of which remains exist, appears to have been the Ogam, or Ogham, which is found in numbers of stone inscriptions, dating from about the 3rd century of our era on. About 300 such inscriptions have already been found, most of them in the southwest of Ireland, but some also in Scotland and Wales, and even in Devon and Cornwall. Wherever the Irish Gael planted a colony, he seems to have brought his Ogham writing with him. The Irishman who first invented the Ogham character was probably a pagan who obtained a knowledge of Roman letters. He brought back to Ireland his invention, or, as is more likely, invented it on Irish soil. Indeed, the fact that no certain trace of Ogham writing has been found upon the European continent indicates that the alphabet was invented in Ireland itself. An inscription at Killeen Cormac, County Kildare, survives, which seems to show that the Roman alphabet was known in Ireland in pagan times. Ogham is an alphabet suitable enough for chiseling upon stones, but too cumbrous for the purposes of literature. For this the Roman alphabet must have been used. The Ogham script consists of a number of short lines, straight or slanting, and drawn either below, above, or through one long stem line. This stem line is generally the sharp angle between two faces or sides of a long upright rectangular stone. Thus 4 cuts to the right of the long line stand for S, to the left of it they mean C, passing through it, half on one side and half on the other, they mean Z. The device was rude, but it was applied with considerable skill, and it was undoubtedly framed with much ingenuity. The vowels, occurring most often, are also the easiest to cut, being scarcely more than notches on the edge of the stone. The inscription generally consists of the name of the dead warrior over whom the memorial was raised. It usually begins on the left corner of the stone facing the reader, and is to be read upwards, and is often continued down on the right-hand angular line as well. The language of the Ogham inscriptions is very ancient, and nearly the same forms occur as in what we know of Old Gaulish. The language, in fact, seems to have been an antique survival, even when it was first engraved in the 3rd or 4th century. The word forms are probably far older than those used in the spoken language of the time. This is a very important conclusion, and it must have a far-reaching bearing upon the history of the earliest epic literature. Because if forms of language much more ancient than any that were then current were employed on pillar stones in the 3rd or 4th century, it follows that this obsolescent language must have survived either in a written or a regularly recited form. This immediately raises the probability that the substance of Irish epic literature, which was written down on parchment in the 6th or 7th century, really dates from a period much more remote, and that all that is purely pagan in it was preserved for us in the same antique language as the Ogham inscriptions before it was translated into what we now call Old Irish. The following is the Ogham alphabet as preserved on some 300 ancient pillars and stones in the probably 9th century treatise in the Book of Ballymote and elsewhere. Each letter consists of 1 to 5 parallel strokes in increasing order as follows: above the stem line, H, D, T, C, Q; below the stem line, B, L, V, S, N; diagonally across it, M, G, NG, Z, R; vertically across it in short notches, A, O, U, E, I. There are a great many allusions to this Ogham writing in the ancient epics, especially in those that are purely pagan in form and conception, and there can be no doubt that the knowledge of letters must have reached Ireland before the island became Christianized. With the introduction of Christianity and of Roman letters, the old Ogham inscriptions, which were no doubt looked upon as flavoring of paganism, quickly fell into disuse and disappeared, but some inscriptions, at least, are as late as the year 600 or even 800. In the thoroughly pagan poem, The Voyage of Bran, which such authorities as Zimma and Kuno Maya both consider to have been committed to parchment in the 7th century, we find it stated that Bran wrote the 50 or 60 quatrains of the poem in Ogham. Cuchulainn constantly used Ogham writing, which he cut upon wands and trees and standing stones, for Queen Maeve's army to read, and these were always brought to his friend Fergus to decipher. Cormac, king of Cashel, in his glossary, tells us that the pagan Irish used to inscribe the wands they kept for measuring corpses and graves with Ogham characters, and that it was a source of horror to anyone even to take it in his hand. St. Patrick, in his Confession, the authenticity of which no one doubts, describes how he dreamt that a man from Ireland came to him with innumerable letters. In Irish legend, Ogma, one of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who was skilled in dialects and poetry, seems to be credited with the invention of the Ogham alphabet, and he probably was the equivalent of the Gaulish god Ogmios, the god of eloquence, so interestingly described by Lucian. We may take it then that the Irish pagans knew sufficient letters to hand down to Irish Christians the substance of their pagan epics, sagas, and poems. We may take it for granted also that the greater Irish epics, purely pagan in character, utterly untouched in substance by that Christianity which so early conquered the country, really represent the thoughts, manners, feelings, and customs of pagan Ireland. The effect of this conclusion must be startling indeed to those who know the ancient world only through the medium of Greek and Roman literature. To the Greek and to his admiring master, the Roman, all outside races were simply barbarians, at once despised, misinterpreted, and misunderstood. We have no possible means of reconstructing the ancient world as it was lived by the ancestors of some of the leading races in Europe, the Gauls, Spaniards, Britons, and the people of all those countries which trace themselves back to a Celtic ancestry, because these races have left no literature or records behind them, and the Greeks and Romans, who tell us about them, saw everything through the false medium of their own prejudices. But now, since the discovery and publication of the Irish sagas and epics, the descendants of these great races no longer find it necessary to view their own past through the colored and distorting glasses of the Greek or the Roman, since there has now opened for them, where they least expected to find it, a window through which they can look steadily at the life of their race, or of one of its leading offshoots, in one of its strongholds, and reconstruct for themselves with tolerable accuracy the life of their own ancestors. It is impossible to overrate the importance of this for the history of Europe, because neither Teutons nor Slavs have preserved pictures of their own heroic past dating from pagan times. It is only the Celts, and of these the Irish, who have handed down such pictures drawn with all the fond intimacy of romance, and descriptions which exhibit the life of Western Europeans at an even earlier culture stage in the evolution of humanity than do the poems of Homer. This conclusion, to which a study of the literature invites us, falls in exactly with that arrived at from purely archaeological sources. Professor Ridgway of Cambridge University, working on archaeological lines, expresses himself as follows: "From this survey of the material remains of the La Tène period found actually in Ireland, and from the striking correspondence between this culture and that depicted in the Táin Bó Cúailnge, and from the circumstance that the race who are represented in the epic as possessing this form of culture, resemble in their physique the tall, fair-haired, grey-eyed Celts of Britain and the Continent, we are justified in inferring, 1. That there was an invasion or invasions of such peoples from Gaul in the centuries immediately before Christ, as is described by the Irish traditions, and 2. That the poems themselves originally took shape when the La Tène culture was still flourishing in Ireland. But as this could hardly have continued much later than A.D. 100, we may place the first shaping of the poems not much later than that date, and possibly a century earlier." This conclusion would make the earliest putting together of the Irish epics almost contemporaneous with Augustus Caesar. So much for the history and growth of Irish letters. References: Brash, Ogham Inscribed Monuments of the Gael, 1879. Macalister, Studies in Irish Epigraphy, Vol. 1, 1897, Vol. 2, 1902, Vol. 3, 1907. Rees, in Proceedings of the Scottish Society of Antiquaries, Edinburgh, 1892. Ridgway, Date of the First Shaping of the Cuchulainn Saga, 1905, in Proceedings of the British Academy, Vol. 2. Joyce, Social History of Ancient Ireland, Vol. 1, Chapter 2. Preface to Facsimile Edition of the Book of Ballymote. End of section 27. Recording by Owen Cook in Pottawatomie Ceded Land.